He called me ridiculous. In front of everyone. With a smirk on his face and his ego inflated to the ceiling of the gym. I can still hear his laughter echoing between the mats, as if the humiliation had come back to me. My own grandson. Darren. The same boy I cradled, the one I cared for when he had a high fever, the one I shielded from the world when his father left. He was the one who exposed me like that. I just wanted to exercise a little. It wasn't to look young, or to impress anyone. It was just for me. After losing Charles, my husband, I needed to move, distract myself. Do something to keep from falling apart completely. So I gathered up the courage, put on some comfortable clothes, and went to check out the gym they'd opened in the neighborhood. The girl at the front desk was friendly, but as soon as I took my first step into the weight room, all eyes were on me like spears. But the worst was yet to come. Darren was with a group of friends. All of them pumped up, laughing loudly, taking pictures in the mirror. And when he saw me, he laughed like he'd seen a circus clown walk in by mistake. He pointed at me, loudly, very loudly, and said, "Look at that old lady trying to be fit. She'll break her hip just by touching the treadmill." People laughed. They laughed at me. The woman who gave everything for that family. And he reveled in it. As if I were a joke, a nuisance, a misplaced old woman who should be at home sewing or watching soap operas. I wanted to disappear. I left with my heart in pieces. I felt small, useless, weak. I spent the rest of the day in silence, sitting on the porch with my cup of tea, staring into space. And it was in that silence that I remembered something old. Something my grandmother always said when she was disrespected. We don't raise our voices. We raise our spirits. That night, I walked into the kitchen. Everything was quiet. Just the sound of the spoon stirring the tea and the faint steam rising. And it was there, with my eyes closed and my soul heavy, that I whispered an old phrase. The kind no one remembers anymore. But I remembered. My grandmother used to say that some words carry more power than slaps. And in that moment, I felt it. Something changed. What happened next? No one could explain. But before I continue, let me ask you something. If you've ever been in a similar situation, if you've ever been humiliated by someone you love, who should have protected you, leave a comment below and tell me. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, take advantage of it now, because this story will move you until the very end. And that's when everything started to change. My name is Louise. I'm 72. 72. When you reach that age, everyone seems to think your life is over. That now you just have to wait. Wait for your body to weaken, your memory to fail, the days to become the same, one after the other, like a poorly used carbon copy from the previous week. But what no one sees is the behind the scenes of old age. What really happens inside us when silence takes over the house, when the phone stops ringing, when birthdays become emptier. When my husband, Charles, passed away, after 47 years of marriage, something inside me broke. It wasn't just my heart. It was my routine, my sense of belonging, my purpose. He was the one who laughed at my repetitive stories, who secretly adjusted the thermostat just to tease me, who brought me evening tea even though he said, "Tea doesn't warm the heart." He left on a grey morning, the kind that seems eternal. And since then, the days have lost some of their color. What was once shared has become silence. At first, I tried to keep things in order. The house tidy, the fridge stocked, my favorite TV shows on time. But time began to drag. Until one day, as I stared out the kitchen window with my mug in hand, I realized I had stopped. Stopped laughing, talking, dreaming. Stopped living. And there, between one memory and another, something inside me ignited. A small, almost imperceptible, but still alive, spark. The desire to feel part of the world again. That's when the idea for the gym came to me. It might seem simple to someone in their 20s or 30s. But for me, just the thought of putting on sneakers and walking into a room full of mirrors and toned bodies was a challenge greater than any other. I didn't even know where to begin. But there was something in that decision that was uniquely mine. A way to prove to myself that I could still transform myself, that my body and mind still had something to offer. The decision to move again wasn't about vanity. It was about dignity, about inner strength. So I went. I signed up, bought a new pair of sweatpants, tied my hair back with a hair tie I found in the back of a drawer, and went. I felt my heart race as if I were committing a crime. But I didn't turn back. I stepped into that gym like someone entering forbidden territory. And that's where it all happened. The pain of humiliation, Darren's laughter, the judgmental looks, but also something deeper. The realization that I wasn't there for anyone else. Just for myself. That night, after the incident, I sat in the kitchen as I did every night. I made my chamomile tea, the same one I'd been making for decades. But there was something different in the air. A light, almost imperceptible electricity. I picked up my grandmother's antique iron teapot, the one she said, holds the soul of tea. I stirred slowly, watching the steam rise as if carrying secrets from the past. And when I murmured those words I'd heard so many times as a girl, I wasn't quite sure what I was doing. But I felt I needed to. Not as revenge, but as a response. An ancient response. You could call it intuition. You could say it was the universe. Or it was coincidence. But deep down, something inside me knew that night wasn't like the others. And the curious thing is, this feeling didn't scare me. On the contrary, it brought me calm. It was as if everything I'd experienced, the loss, the loneliness, the contempt, was finally making sense. As if the cycle was closing so a new one could begin. I didn't sleep that night. I sat there in the rocking chair, listening to the sounds of the house, watching the shadow of the curtain dance across the floor in the wind. And when the clock struck 3 in the morning, I heard a crack coming from the kitchen. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to wake me up. And it was only the next day, when I opened the pantry door, that I realized. The pantry door creaked as it always does. But there was something strange in the air. A dense sensation, as if time had stopped inside. The container of protein powder lay on the floor, open. Its contents scattered among bags of rice and an expired package of oatmeal. I stopped. I just stared. No one had entered the kitchen. I was sure of it. The place was locked, as always. It was impossible for that container to have simply slipped. But even with the strangeness, I felt no fear. It was almost as if the universe were whispering, "You're on the right track, Louise." But before all of this, before the pot dropped, Darren's fever, the shifting of gazes, there was that first step. The hardest. The loneliest. The moment when I, a 72-year-old woman, decided to step into a modern gym for the first time, full of sculpted bodies, unfamiliar music, and mirrors everywhere. I entered with my heart racing, my hands cold, and my stomach tight. It was as if I were stepping through a portal into a world that didn't belong to me. The receptionist smiled politely, like someone treating a distant aunt well. She handed me a form, asked for some information, and showed me the weight room. When the glass doors opened, the first thing I noticed was the sound. Loud. A pulsating repetitive rhythm that seemed to rise from the floor and climb up my legs. The second thing was the smell. A mixture of sweat, expensive deodorant, and pretense. And finally, the looks. Oh, the looks. They weren't of anger, nor of disgust. They were worse. They were looks of barely concealed surprise, of silent judgment. Those eyes said without words, "What is this old woman doing here?" I took a few hesitant steps, trying to appear confident. The mirror showed me an image I barely recognized, baggy sweatpants, my late husband's t-shirt, hair tied up hastily. Around me, women in tight tops and men with tattooed arms lifted weights as if they were about to take off. I felt like running. But something inside me said, "You've come this far. Now come in." And then, way back in the room, I saw him. Darren. With a group of friends, laughing about something on his phone. Until he saw me. His smile widened like a predator spotting weaker prey. He pointed. Look over there, guys. CrossFit Grandma's here. The laughter was instantaneous. It spread through the room like cheap perfume. One of the guys even imitated my walk, shuffling his feet and making a cartoonishly old-age sound. My face burned. I tried to look down, pretend it wasn't me. But it was. It was completely me. The cruelest thing was that it came from someone I loved. Darren was my grandson. My own flesh and blood. And there he was, ridiculing me in public as if I were a nuisance, a ready-made joke. An outdated figure trying to invade the sacred space of youth. The impact wasn't just emotional. It was physical. My legs felt weak, my breath short. But I didn't cry. I didn't run away. I turned around slowly, walked out the same glass door, and walked to my car, my heart pounding in my ears. On that drive home, something stirred inside me. It wasn't sadness. It was something deeper. A mixture of anger, disappointment, and a strange clarity. A kind of silent awareness that this humiliation wasn't the end of my story. It was just the crack through which the light would shine. From that moment on, I realized I had reached a point of no return. Either I surrendered once and for all to the idea that my time had passed, or I found a new way of existing. A way that was mine. Authentic. Unshakable. When I got home, I went straight to the kitchen. I took off my shoes, filled the kettle, and turned on the stove. The water took a while to boil, but I didn't even notice the time passing. My eyes were fixed on the window, where the sky was beginning to darken. The afternoon shadows invaded the living room floor, and the clock on the wall, the one Charles hung for our first Christmas here, was still. It read exactly 5:17 p.m. The hand didn't move. A trivial detail, perhaps. But there, in that moment, it felt like a sign. A symbolic pause between who I had been until now, and who I was about to become. The tea was ready. I chose a different cup than the one I use every day. It was an antique, blue porcelain with a gold rim, an heirloom from my grandmother. I poured the tea, added honey, and sat at the table. The steam rose slowly, as if dancing. And then, the words came. Quietly. Almost a whisper. Words that had been stored inside me for years, buried in childhood memories, on stormy nights when my grandmother would whisper things I didn't understand. At that moment, without knowing exactly why, I repeated what she said. What is born of disrespect, does not flourish. And then, as if something had been released from the silence, the air around me felt denser. A feeling hard to describe. It wasn't fear. It was intensity. A presence. As if time had bent just a little, just enough to hear my voice. And there, in that simple kitchen, with no audience, no likes, no approval, I felt for the first time in a long time, power. And that's how everything began to change, even though, on the surface, nothing seemed different yet. Darren, my grandson, was one of the loudest laughers. His laugh was familiar to the whole family. Loud, exaggerated, almost theatrical. It was the kind of laugh that filled the room, not because it was funny, but because it carried with it that desire to be the center of attention, always. He'd been like that since he was a child. Intelligent, handsome, but starved for applause. He always needed to prove himself. At school, at soccer with his friends, and now at the gym. It was as if the mirror was the only place he could truly see himself. He'd always been strong. Not just physically. Darren learned to steel his face, speak loudly, and walk as if he was certain of everything. But behind that muscular body and well-groomed beard, there was something empty. Something he tried to hide with sarcasm. I could see it. Maybe because I was one of the few people who looked at him without fear. But that day he forgot. Or simply chose to ignore it. When he saw me enter the gym, he froze for a second, as if he didn't know what he was seeing. Then his astonishment turned to mockery. He was with two friends, one with a towel over his shoulder, the other taking a selfie in the mirror. Darren pointed at me and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Look who decided to work out. The CrossFit girl is here, everyone." The two friends burst out laughing. One of them even imitated someone limping, hand behind his back, making an ouch, ouch, my joints sound. Darren laughed so hard he had to rest his hand on the bench press. He was enjoying himself as if it were the best joke of the year. I stood still for a moment. My eyes met his. And he just smiled contemptuously. A smile that pierced me like a knife. There was no love, no respect, no embarrassment. It was just arrogance. Coldness. An inflated ego trying to keep the stage under control. Others around me began to pay attention. They didn't say anything. They didn't laugh. But they didn't defend themselves either. It was as if my embarrassment had become part of the collective training. And the cruelest thing of all was realizing that, to them, I wasn't someone's grandmother. I was just a displaced presence. A reminder of something no one wants to see. That time passes. That youth isn't eternal. That the mirror will one day show a different image. And that bothers me. I took a deep breath. I didn't say a word. I just turned and walked away. The laughter still echoed as I pushed open the glass door. But inside, something had broken. And that break wasn't pain. It was clarity. It was as if, amidst the humiliation, I'd seen the hidden truth behind it all. The truth about Darren. About me. About how the world treats those who no longer fit the mold of productive, beautiful, or acceptable. On the way back, I tried to find explanations. Was he embarrassed of me? Was he ashamed of his aging grandmother? Or was the problem himself? The insecurity, the fear of appearing weak in front of others, the constant need to perform a version of himself that never truly existed. Darren had always been vain. He spent more on creams and supplements than on food. He owned 3 pairs of running shoes, but he never pursued anything that didn't involve his own image. He was the kind of person who knew everything about the body, but almost nothing about the heart. And that day, in front of everyone, he didn't just laugh at me. He laughed at his own story. At the woman who raised him when his mother had to work double time. At the woman who made heart-shaped pancakes on Sunday mornings. He mocked his roots. And maybe that's why it hurt so much. Because it wasn't just the mockery of an arrogant boy. It was the negation of everything I represented. As if time had erased my importance. As if my presence was now uncomfortable, laughable, disposable. It affected me in a way I didn't even know was possible. Not out of vanity but out of memory. Out of legacy. Because we don't always expect gratitude, but we also don't expect to be the butt of jokes. I arrived home in silence. I didn't cry. I just took off my jacket, hung it on the chair, and stared at the living room floor as if waiting for answers. And deep down, I knew they wouldn't come from anyone. But from what lives deep within. From that forgotten part of us that only reveals itself when all seems lost. That's when I understood. It wasn't about Darren. It was about me. About what I was going to do with this. With the pain. With the shame. With the anger that grew like roots in dry soil. And in that instant, between one breath and the next, I felt a different presence in the air. A mixture of memory and determination. As if something ancient was awakening from a deep slumber. As if, within me, a forgotten part had finally awakened. I returned home without finishing my workout. I didn't even try to hide it. I simply grabbed my bag, fought back the tears with all my remaining strength, and walked through that noisy room like someone walking down a hallway of judgment. My footsteps echoed on the polished floor, each one seeming to weigh more than the last. Inside, it felt like I was carrying decades of disappointment on my shoulders. It wasn't just because of Darren. It was because of all the times I'd been ignored, underestimated, discarded. I felt like I was 90 years old. As if everything in me had aged in a single second. My bones, my thoughts, even my hope. I reached the sidewalk and breathed in the cold morning air as if trying to stifle a scream. The tears didn't fall. Not yet. But they were there, piled behind my eyes, ready to spill out at the first crack of silence. I got in the car, closed the door, and for a few seconds I stood there, hands on the steering wheel and head down. The voices from inside the gym still echoed, like a cruel whisper that wouldn't leave me alone. I drove slowly through the neighborhood streets. The same streets I'd taken Darren to school, where we'd ridden our bikes when he was little, where he'd learned to cross the street on his own. Every corner held a piece of our history. But now everything felt different. As if the city had shrunk, and I'd grown too big to fit anywhere. An invisible disarray that only those who felt out of place will understand. When I got home, the key fell out of my hand. It was one of those silly details that speaks volumes. I calmly picked it up, turned the lock, and let myself in. The silence of the house embraced me almost suffocatingly. I took off my shoes right there in the hallway and went straight to the kitchen, as I always do. The kettle was still on the stove from the night before. I filled it with water, turned on the burner, and sat in my usual chair, leaning my back against the same spot on the wall where my Charles used to rest his arm. The steam rose slowly, but time seemed frozen. I felt small. Not because of my age, but inside. As if all my memories had been emptied of meaning. The woman I once was, strong, present, confident, seemed to have been erased by a gesture, a malicious laugh, a phrase that shouldn't have come from a grandson. It was as if I were watching my own life from the outside, voiceless, without a stage, without importance. That morning, not even the tea brought me comfort. It tasted bitter, even with the honey. I gripped the mug with both hands and stood there, staring at the wall, as if some answer would emerge from the tiles. But nothing came. Just that heaviness in my chest. The feeling of having been betrayed. Not just by Darren, but by everyone who chooses to laugh when they should be welcoming. By a world that applauds youth and forgets those who helped build it. For a few minutes, I let the pain take over. I didn't try to pretend everything was okay. I wasn't strong. I was real. I felt sorry for myself. I felt angry. I felt ashamed. I felt everything together. It was a deep dive into a part of me I avoid facing. The part that still waits for a phone call that never comes. That hears the laughter in the apartment next door and wonders when it stopped being invited to that kind of joy. The part that looks in the mirror and sees wrinkles that tell stories, but now only seem like signs that it's past time to shut up. I got up, went to the window, and stood there for an indescribable amount of time. Outside, life went on. People coming and going, cars passing, children running to school with backpacks bigger than their size. And there I was, invisible. As if the world had moved on without me. As if I'd been forgotten at a station where the train no longer runs. I can't explain what kept me from collapsing. Maybe it was exhaustion. Or maybe it was something older. A strength that doesn't come from the head, but from the body's memory. From the blood. From everything my grandmother told me when I thought the world was too cruel. Those who aren't seen are sometimes just those who are watching from elsewhere. And that's when the tears came. Slowly. Without fuss. Warm. They weren't just pain. They were liberation. It was as if each drop washed away a part of what had been denied me that day. A kind of new beginning. Not the pretty kind, with music playing in the background and light streaming through the window. But a real, silent, intimate new beginning. Afterward, I sat in the living room chair and picked up one of the old photos. Darren and I, he was still small, his eyes shining and his fingers smeared with chocolate. That boy was still in there. I knew it. But I also knew he might never appear again. Or that he would only appear after a setback. The kind life throws at us when we don't listen to what we should. And without understanding, I returned to the kitchen. I made the tea again. I chose a different cup this time. An older, heavier one. One that seemed to have a history. The steam rose strongly. The scent of the infusion filled the house like a reminder. I sat, stared into space, and heard a phrase come from memory like a whisper. What is born of disrespect does not flourish. And in that moment, with my heart still in pieces and my mind riddled with memories, I understood that there was something inside me that I hadn't yet given up on. A forgotten, yet living part. A presence that, even without explanation, was beginning to take up space again. The house was silent that night, one of those silences that doesn't frighten, but seems filled with invisible meaning. It was a heavy silence, but not oppressive, almost as if the air were denser, more attentive. Everything seemed to be waiting for something, even the kitchen clock, the round one with a light wood frame that I hadn't changed since Charles installed it. The hands turned normally, until they stopped. They simply froze at 9:42 p.m. And for some reason, I didn't find it strange. I made my tea as usual. Chamomile with a little honey. The water boiled slowly, and the kettle whistled more deeply than usual. Or maybe it was just my perception, altered by everything that had happened that day. I moved as if I were in an old movie, one with a low soundtrack and warm lighting. The kitchen light was soft, a bit yellowish, casting long shadows on the walls. I sat alone as always, in the chair at the end of the table, the warm cup in my hands. As the steam rose from the drink, something inside me also began to rise. A memory. A sensation that had no name, but which carried with it the scent of wet earth, clothes on the line, and a lit candle on a stormy day. It was like returning to my grandmother's house, where everything seemed magical even though no one used that word. I remembered her voice, hoarse and firm, repeating things that at the time had sounded strange, but now seemed to carry secret codes. Phrases spoken as if invoking silent forces. It wasn't superstition. It was legacy. My grandmother used to say, when the mouth doesn't resolve, the spirit acts. And I never knew exactly what she meant by that. Until that night. It was as if, there in the kitchen, time had folded in on itself. Everything slowed down. Even the sound of the wind outside seemed rhythmic, like an ancient breath. And then, without thinking, without rationalizing, I simply let those words slip from my mouth, words that had been stored deep in my memory. What is born of disrespect does not flourish. It was almost a whisper. But the next second, I swear I felt something move at the window. It wasn't a bang. Not a start. Just a slight tremor in the glass, as if the wind had blown past with more intent than usual. My eyes automatically returned to the clock. Stopped. Still showing 9:42. A shiver ran down my spine, but it wasn't fear. It was familiarity. It was as if, somehow, I was completing something that began long before me. A kind of invisible continuity between generations. As if what was whispered there had been heard by someone other than me. I could say it was all imagination, that fatigue distorted my perception. But there are moments in life when reason bows before the sensible truth. And the truth is, there was something different that night. Something subtle, but present. A change in the temperature of my soul, as if my pain had been seen, acknowledged, and set in motion. I remained there, silent. The drink was already lukewarm, but I still held the cup like an anchor. I remembered the night I lost Charles. The room was full of people, but even so, I felt alone. That loneliness you can't fill with company, only with a real presence. And now, in some way I can't explain, I felt like there was something present there with me. It wasn't him. Not exactly. It was more like a force, ancient, steady, silent, that hovered in the air. I thought about Darren. The way he'd looked at me, the way he'd ridiculed me. The impact of it still stung, but for the first time, I didn't just feel pain. I felt clarity. It was as if I'd finally seen who he'd become, unfiltered by the loving grandmother who'd always protected him. And what I saw wasn't pretty. It was a broken mirror of everything I'd tried to teach him, and that he'd chosen to forget. And at the same time, there was compassion. Because behind the arrogance, I knew there was fear. Fear of growing old, of no longer being seen, of losing control. I knew this fear. It visited me often. But now it no longer ruled me. I stood there until the clock started ticking again. And it did. Alone. The hands moved slowly, as if nothing had happened. The sound of them ticking back into rhythm was almost a relief. As if time were saying, now we can move on. But something inside me had already changed. Not on the outside, but inside, deep down, where decisions are born without fanfare. Where transformation begins before it even shows itself. I closed my eyes for a few seconds and felt the presence moving away. Not disappearing, just retreating, like someone respecting space after delivering a message. When I opened my eyes, the kitchen looked the same. But I was no longer the same woman who had entered it hours before. Something had been triggered. A switch turned. An internal movement initiated. As if the world around me had taken a step toward me, or perhaps I had finally taken a step toward myself. And that's when the sound of the pantry cabinet rang out. Low, metallic, like a tin can rolling gently. I calmly got up, took a deep breath, and walked over. I opened the door, and what I saw stopped me for a moment. A jar, Darren's protein shaker, that is, had fallen from the top shelf. And it was open. The lid had rolled a foot away. The house was closed. No tremors, no wind. Nothing that could logically explain it. And yet, there it was. The contents partially spilled, as if someone or something had decided to touch the untouchable. I woke up early that morning, even though I hadn't slept much. You know when your body rests, but your soul is still moving on? That was the feeling. I got out of bed with that heaviness in my chest that comes after an emotionally disorganized day. But along with it, there was something new. A kind of inner silence, but not emptiness. It was more like an interval, a space between two chapters of the same story. The house was still dark when I entered the kitchen. The scent of the previous night still lingered in the air, a mixture of chamomile and suspended time. I approached the cabinet where, hours earlier, I'd found Darren's fallen protein shaker. It was still there. The lid rolled to the side, the powder scattered like sand from a broken clock. For a second, I hesitated to touch it. It felt wrong to fix it. As if it were evidence of something I couldn't name, but which, somehow, I respected. I closed the cabinet door without cleaning anything. It was as if I felt it needed to stay there, a reminder that some things happen the way they need to. And so, I went about my morning. I made coffee, tidied the kitchen, watered the plants. Everything went at the usual pace, but with a different level of attention. My every gesture seemed watched by something invisible. Not threateningly, but as if someone were taking note. It was as if I had crossed a silent line and now everything was being recorded by unseen eyes. Around 9, I heard the front door slam open. It was Darren. I could recognize the sound of his backpack being thrown onto the couch and his steady footsteps in the hallway. But something was different. He didn't say anything, didn't shout, didn't turn on the TV. He just walked straight past, in a strange rush, and locked the hallway bathroom door with a sharp click. The next few minutes were revealing. First came the noises. Stumbling, muffled groans, the sound of the toilet flushing 2-3 times in succession. Then, silence. And then more noises. A repetitive, uncomfortable pattern that only those who've had a serious stomach bug know. I remained in the kitchen, silent. Not out of malice. But because, deep down, I knew this was his moment with himself. A kind of inevitable confrontation that didn't require my intervention. The sounds continued for over an hour. Sometimes he mumbled something, as if trying to talk to himself. Other times, the only sound was the running water. And with each new noise, the feeling grew clearer that this day would not go on like any other. Darren wouldn't leave the bathroom. Literally. He was trapped inside, as if pushed by a greater force, forced to stop, to look, to feel. I didn't knock. I didn't offer tea, or ask if he was okay. It was the first time I'd allowed myself to observe from afar, without the urge to save, fix, or comfort. It was a role I'd lived for too long. But now, it was as if that responsibility had been lifted from my hands. He needed to feel it. Not just physically, but completely. Hours passed. The day wore on outside, with the sun streaming through the cracks in the window, but inside, time seemed stretched out. Around 2 in the afternoon, he emerged. His face pale, his hair plastered to his forehead, his expression haggard. He looked at me as if he saw something he didn't understand but respected. No words were spoken. He simply walked past me, slowly, as if crossing that kitchen required more than brawn. And it was at that moment that our eyes met. His was a silent question. Mine would return an answer that didn't need to be spoken. He couldn't explain what had happened. But he felt it. He felt it in his body, in his mind, maybe even in his soul. Those hours in the bathroom had done more than just mess with his gut. They had messed with the inner structure of a boy who thought he could laugh at everything, who could mock the pain of those who came before. But now he was different. He still didn't know how to deal with it, but he wasn't the same anymore. He rubbed the back of his neck, looked away, and went into his room without saying anything. The sound of the door closing was soft, without a fuss. And everything was silent again. But this time, a different silence. More meaningful. The kind of silence that comes after something important has happened, even if no one knows exactly what. I sat back down at the kitchen table, unhurried. The mug was still half empty. The tea, now cold, carried a bitter taste that didn't come from the chamomile. It was the taste of reality. Of those moments when life decides to act on its own, without a script, without rehearsal, without asking permission. And it was there, with a cup in my hands, that I began to notice the first signs of something still forming. A subtle shift in the air, in the gestures, in the little things. Darren hadn't said a single word yet. But sometimes, silence carries more impact than any rehearsed phrase. And that silence was charged. In the days that followed that heavy silence, something in the house began to change. Not blatantly, nor with grand speeches. But in the way the doors closed more carefully. In the way his steps seemed lighter, more conscious. Darren didn't talk much, and I didn't force conversation either. But there was a new frequency in the air, a kind of different rhythm that only those who pay attention to detail can perceive. He stopped laughing. Not just at me. He stopped that automatic mocking laugh he used as a shield against everything that made him feel small. It was as if something inside him had frozen, or maybe collapsed completely. For the first time in a long time, he seemed quiet. Not silent out of pride or contempt, but silent because he was listening. The kind of silence that reveals more than it hides. The first morning we passed each other again in the kitchen, he came in barefoot, his hair messy and his eyes still heavy from sleep, or maybe it was from inner turmoil. He saw me stirring the tea and stood still for a few seconds. As if that simple image, the kettle, the steam, my steady hands, had triggered something in his memory. And then, for the first time since the bathroom episode, he spoke to me. "This is the chamomile one, right?" he asked, without looking directly into my eyes. I simply nodded. No more was needed. That gesture was already significant. Almost symbolic. After so many years in which everything I represented to him seemed outdated, useless, now he saw me doing something so simple, and wanted to know more. That spoke volumes. Not because of the tea itself, but because of the willingness to ask. Over the next few days, he began to appear more frequently around the house. No longer as someone who crosses the room just to grab something and leave, but as someone who is present. Sometimes, just to sit on the porch while I watered the plants. Other times, with unexpected questions that seemed born of curiosity rather than obligation. "How long were you and Grandpa together?" Or "What was that song you used to sing when I was little?" These questions were always accompanied by a different look. Less hurried. More curious. And there was a certain care in the way he listened to me. As if he were trying to recover something he'd lost along the way. Or perhaps, something he'd never truly had. It was as if the impact of those events had created a chink in his armor, revealing what had always been underneath. A sensitive, confused boy searching for direction. One of those mornings, he appeared in the kitchen and asked if he could try one of my teas. I'd made a light blend of fennel, chamomile, and mint, the one my grandmother used to make on cold nights. I handed him the cup, and for the first time in years, He accepted something from me without question, without turning up his nose. He sat in the chair at the end of the table, the same one his grandfather used to sit in, and stayed there, not fiddling with his phone, not plugging in his headphones. Just there, present, sipping slowly, as if the tea had a flavor he couldn't name, but that touched him somehow. That image of him, so serene, so different from the Darren who would come into the house slamming the door and speaking loudly, resonated with me. Not because I expected it, but because I always knew there was something more to him. Something beyond the muscles, the Instagram filters, and the know-it-all attitude. There was a boy who had to toughen up too soon, who perhaps never learned to deal with loss, with silence, with the idea that life doesn't revolve around youth. And now he seemed willing to listen. Not just to me but to himself. One day he walked over to the bookshelf in the living room and picked up an old photo album. He began leafing through it slowly, running his finger over the images as if trying to summon memories through the corners of his skin. He stopped at a photo of him sitting on my lap, about 3 years old, eating popcorn and making faces. He laughed lightly. But it was a different kind of laugh. The laugh of someone reconnecting with something forgotten. "You've always been patient with me, haven't you?" he said without looking at me. I didn't respond. I just continued folding the clothes on the couch. Because some things don't need to be said back. They just need to be felt. But deep down, that sentence pierced me. It was like a camouflaged apology. As if he was saying, "I know what I did," without actually using those words. These small gestures, these new layers of connection between us, became the true miracle of that house. Nothing spectacular. Nothing with fireworks. But with a quiet value that only those who have lost the respect of someone they love can understand. It was as if he was building, step by step, a new way of being close. A more mature way. More conscious. And I, who had already buried so many expectations, found myself faced with something unexpected. The real possibility of rebuilding. Not as before, because before no longer exists. But as it is now. In the time we still have left. The next night, he washed his own tea mug and asked if I had any more of that mixture. I said yes, and he smiled. And for a second, his face reminded me exactly of the same boy in the photo. Light, sincere, real. That image stayed with me. Like a new photograph, made only from memory. And I knew then and there that something inside him, and inside me, had changed. It was on a morning like so many others, without any special announcement, that he finally spoke. The sun was still rising, casting that low golden light through the kitchen windows. I was facing away, stirring the pot of porridge, when I heard his footsteps approaching slowly. Those steps no longer carried the weight of arrogance, nor the hurried pace of someone trying to escape the other's presence. They were careful steps. A complete presence. And when he stopped behind me, he remained silent for a moment that seemed longer than it actually was. "Sorry, Grandma. I was an idiot." Those were all the words. Simple. Raw. Without flourish. But spoken with a truth that cannot be taught. His voice was firm but low, as if each syllable weighed more than he was accustomed to carrying. I didn't turn around right away. I continued stirring the porridge, not out of coldness, but because I knew the moment deserved space. I needed to leave him there, naked before his own conscience, before offering any response. After a few seconds, I turned off the heat, rested the wooden spoon on the edge of the sink, and turned around. His head was down, his eyes fixed on the ground, like a boy who knows he's crossed a line and finally understands the extent of the damage. But there was something in his shoulders that touched me deeply. It wasn't regret for convenience. It was emotional exhaustion. The weariness of someone who's carried for too long an armor too heavy for the heart beneath. He didn't know what to expect from me. And I knew it. "You hurt me, Darren." My voice was calm, firm. "Not because you laughed at me at the gym, but because you forgot who I am." He looked up immediately. Those words hit harder than any scolding I could have given. I saw it. I saw that jolt of memory in his eyes, as if he were, right there, reliving all the moments I'd been around. The parties, the crises, the small victories he'd never celebrated alone. It was as if the penny had finally dropped, and there was nothing left between us but the raw truth of what we are to each other. But there was love there, too. A love half hidden by years of emotional distance, by masks he wore to survive in this world of appearances and validation. A love that never died, but remained hidden between the demands of pride and the urge to appear invulnerable. I approached and lightly touched his arm. It wasn't a hug. It was a gesture. But a gesture full of history. And it was enough. He took a deep breath, as if releasing something that had been trapped for too long. And then he said, his eyes welling up, "I still have a lot to learn, right?" "We all do," I replied with a half-smile. "But knowing you need to learn is half the battle." There was no theater there. There was no need for embellished forgiveness. It was just life, naked and real, doing what it does best when we let it. Breaking, healing, and rebuilding. That moment didn't erase the pain. But it redefined everything. It transformed a wound into a bridge. A conflict into clarity. That day, we had breakfast together, something we hadn't done in years. He ate slowly, as if tasting something for the first time. And for the first time, he asked to hear one of his grandfather's old stories, the ones he always pretended to find boring. He listened quietly, laughed at the right moment, and asked me questions he'd never been interested in before. How did you two meet? Was he this stubborn when he was young? I responded slowly. Each word seemed to find a new place within him. As if, by telling him about my past, I was giving him something of his own future. He didn't say, "I love you." He didn't even need to. It was in his gaze. In his care. In the way he washed his own cup without me asking. In the way he held the refrigerator door open for me, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Later that day, he left the house to go training. But before closing the door, he took 2 steps back, peeked through the crack, and said, "Grandma, do you want to go with me tomorrow? I promise no one will laugh. And if they do, I'll take care of it." I laughed. Really. Not that polite laugh, but a light, cleansing laugh. I replied that I would think about it. And he smiled like someone who understands that some answers take time. But the invitation alone was a revolution. A symbolic gesture that, finally, he was looking at me with new eyes. Not as a burden. Not as a decorative figure in the house. But as a whole woman. A woman with a past, with scars, with wisdom. And, above all, with a place. After he left, I sat on the porch with my cup of tea, looked up at the sky, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, belonging. And not the kind of belonging that depends on others recognizing it. But the kind of belonging that blossoms when we look at ourselves more generously. When we understand that aging isn't about losing space. It's about gaining depth. And it was there, with the sun beating down gently on my skin, that a certainty formed within me. Not everything can be fixed with words. But some silences heal more than any speech. And sometimes, all we need is a gesture, a look, and a heart willing to begin again. I've never needed to raise my voice to show my strength. In fact, I discovered early on that when we shout, it's because we're not truly being heard, not by others, not by ourselves. But there's something that transcends any barrier, any generation, any resistance. The presence of someone who knows who they are. The silent firmness of someone who carries more than age. They carry history. After that day, I was no longer just Darren's grandma. Nor the old lady who served tea, nor the lady who sews in the late afternoon. I was, finally, someone he could look into the eyes and see deeply. Not because I'd changed, but because he'd changed his perspective. And that changes everything. The truth is, we spend a good part of our lives trying to prove ourselves. At work, in our families, in our relationships. But there comes a time, and there's no set age for this, when you realize you don't need to prove anything anymore. You just need to remember. Remember the woman who survived losses no one saw coming. who cared for her children, her grandchildren, her home, and still kept her own soul alive, who loved deeply, even though she wasn't always understood, who chose peace even when she had every reason to retaliate. And that's what I did. I didn't react with shouting, or insults, or even resentment. I reacted with what my grandmother called the memory of dignity. She said there are things we don't learn from books, but inherit in our blood. A kind of ancestral wisdom that stays with us even when the world tries to make us forget. And when we access this, everything changes. Because you stop seeking validation and start living with intention. Darren felt it. He couldn't name it, but he felt it. He felt it in the look I gave him. He felt it in the silence that wasn't empty. It was full of meaning. He felt it in the way I stood there, firm, unbreakable, even after he'd ridiculed me. It was in this contrast that he understood. That true strength doesn't lie in your muscles, but in what you do with them. In the impact you leave. In the invisible marks you leave on others. And this is a truth that many people take a while to learn. Respect isn't demanded, it's inspired. And genuine respect is born when the other person feels that, right there in their presence, there's something greater than words. There's truth. There's attitude. There's root. That's why I walk differently today. Not because my body has changed. It still hurts sometimes, still gets tired, still complains about the cold. But because my mind is awake. And that changes the whole journey. I'm no longer trying to go back to who I was. I'm becoming everything my younger self needed to know. A woman who knows her worth. Who honors her scars. Who understands the weight and power of silence. Darren still goes to the gym. And every now and then, he invites me. I haven't accepted yet. Not out of pride. But because I now know I can choose. And that's already liberating. Sometimes he comes up with new tea blends and asks if I approve. Other times, he sits with me to listen to stories about the time his grandfather worked in the workshop. He wants to know what that world was like before the screens. And I tell him. Not as someone reliving the past with nostalgia, but as someone sharing the behind-the-scenes strength he's now beginning to respect. He still makes mistakes. He still gets lost. But now, he listens. And listening is a huge step toward awareness. The other day, he called me, elegant lady. I don't know if he said it ironically or tenderly, but he smiled immediately and offered me his arm so we could walk down the stairs together. And I accepted. Because sometimes, accepting the gesture is more transformative than demanding an apology. The biggest lesson I learned from all this is simple. We don't need to shrink to fit into the space others give us. And we also don't need to fight for recognition. Sometimes, all we need is to remain whole, firm in our essence, true to that which no humiliation can erase, our origins, our history, our identity. There's immense power in remembering where we came from. On nights when everything seems uncertain, it's this memory that anchors me. The memory of the woman who raised me, who whispered ancient phrases as she stirred the tea, who believed that the spirit speaks louder than any voice, and who taught me unknowingly how to turn the tables without having to play dirty. If I could leave a single message to the world, it would be this: aging isn't about disappearing. It's about emerging. It's finally ceasing to be shaped by external expectations and beginning to be shaped by internal truths. It's realizing that the wrinkles on your face are just the surface. What really matters are the invisible marks of the courage we had to not remain silent where we should have asserted ourselves. And it was with this mindset that I rediscovered not only my grandson, but myself. I understood that sometimes, life doesn't demand an immediate response. It demands presence. And my presence now is no longer anyone's shadow. It's my own light. And I carry on. With my teas, my memories, my steady hands. With a heart less wounded and more filled with understanding. Because, in the end, we don't need to scream. Sometimes, we just need to remember who we are. And where we come from. And when you remember this, even if the whole world has forgotten, you change the world around you. No fuss. just by being exactly who you were born to be. If you've stuck with me this far, perhaps this story has awakened something within you too. And if it has, it's because you know the weight and value of life's small, silent twists and turns. The ones that make no noise, but leave a mark. This space is for that, for us to exchange experiences, forge memories, and perhaps grow stronger together. So, if this narrative resonated with you, if at any point you thought, I know this pain, subscribe to the channel. It will be great to have you around for future conversations. And leave the phrase, I'm with you until the end in the comments, just so I know this story found a listening heart on the other side. Believe me, this creates an invisible chain between us, and it makes all the difference. Oh, and if this video touched you in any way, leave a like. Not because someone told you to, but because this was carefully crafted, and real connection deserves to be recognized. There's a video here that complements this topic. Click and continue with me there. If you've ever been humiliated by someone in your own family, comment below. You're not alone. And if this story touched you, watch this next one here. It touched me too.